Hello, everyone. I had another discussion that was great to have. I seem to pick the best people for conversations when it comes to a certain topic. One of these days, I should ask for permission to record these discussions because I think you all will enjoy it just as much as I did. Well, anyways, I'm going to do that today, but before that, I will do a recap as always to make sure you're caught up. Some time ago, I said in multiple recordings that games have the potential to be educational. I gave a few examples ranging from Call of Duty all the way up to War of the Roses. War of the Roses was an older medieval game that didn't really survive for very long, but so I used all these different examples to say, this is what you could do in this situation to be educational and things like that. In the Call of Duty example, I specifically stated that just having the guns there and making people aware of those guns is more than enough to be educational. Because in some countries, the use of firearms is banned unless you're like a farmer or a hunter or something like that. But even then, you're pretty limited when compared to countries like the United States, where they don't really seem to care what kind of firearm you have. But that's a completely different discussion. Either way, people just don't have that experience some of the time, is what I'm trying to get at. And so because they don't have that experience, it's kind of interesting to hear about those things. That's the short version of the prior recordings and what I was saying. Let me talk about what this recording is going to do. If the games aren't going to be educational like I had hoped, then I'll do my part to be educational by sharing this discussion with you, the one I had with these people, because a lot of what we discussed is really nothing new to us. My group of people that have these discussions, we're all passionate about history, I guess you can say. Firearms and other technologies are part of history, so we do discuss this for that reason, and also because some of us are gun enthusiasts. So I've chosen a couple of examples, but I won't cover all the examples that are in games, because if I were to cover all of the guns that are in game, this would be way too long of recording, and honestly, I don't think that I'm the right person for that. I can hold a conversation, but not for very long, and I recognize that one of my flaws is my inability to properly explain or share my thoughts. It's a flaw of mine. I accept it. It's nothing bad. It's just one of those things. It's not what I'm good at. Okay, so moving on to what I have on the screen. For most people, that have been playing video games, you'll probably recognize the AUG. It's the Bullpup that has shown up in Counter-Strike, Call of Duty, and many other games. I think what a lot of people fail to recognize with the AUG is how deep of a discussion this can really get. Because there's a lot more to the AUG than the history. It marks a pretty interesting decision across the world in terms of the military. This document you've been seeing up on the screen for a while now is the declassified Australian report from the Generation 1 AUG. Steyr is the manufacturer of the AUG, and this was the Australian Army testing of their brand new rifle, and how it fared in comparison to the competition. I'll link this in the description because this is honestly a lot of pages to go through. It will make this recording too long, but the short version is the AUG turned out to be more reliable than the M16 and a couple of others that were tested against it. It wasn't until a few years after this report that Generation 2 and 3 AUGs launched, and from there we saw even more stuff than just its ability to endure. One of the interesting things about Bullpups is that all their parts are in the rear, which means that most of their weight is going to be in the rear. Because of that, and where its parts are, the recoil is going to feel less than an AR-15 because the recoil is closer to your shoulder and it's much easier to manage when it's that far back. You'll notice that also with some of the declassified Australian documents. I don't have them pulled up right now, but they have at times trained soldiers to fire the AUG with one hand. For most people, you would think, well, you're supposed to fire a rifle with two hands, right? Well, there are certain situations where you just absolutely have to do something like that, and the AUG happens to be one of the better weapons for handling that kind of situation. It is entirely possible to fire the Steyr AUG from the shoulder with one hand. It's a pretty interesting rifle and pretty interesting use case for the military. But that's just kind of the quick summary of it. Now, what I think you should look at when, reading about the Steyr AUG is not just that, but also the very interesting discussion behind it. Because when the Steyr AUG was introduced, for the most part, the militaries of the world were used to AR-15 or AK platforms. They weren't used to a bullpup. It was kind of a rare concept by the time the Generation 1 came out. Because of that, the Steyr AUG didn't really, because of that reason and many others, the Steyr AUG didn't really receive as quick of an adoption as some of the other rifles out there like the AK or M16. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just a matter of preference and a couple other factors. So, let's go and talk about that portion now. When the Steyr AUG came out, the U.S. did not go anywhere near it, despite it being far superior to their M16. And I think there's a couple of reasons for this, and this is where I think you'll start to see what I'm talking about. There has been tons of opinions or discussions regarding why the United States didn't adopt the Steyr AUG despite it being superior, and a couple of those reasons include its inability to be accessorized. It would require retraining on the soldiers' end because they were used to AR-15s at that point, aka the M16, later the M4, but it would have required retraining. It would have required different logistics due to the fact that it's made in Europe, not the United States. So it would require different logistics in terms of how to acquire spare parts and things of that nature. And there are probably a couple other factors out there, but those were like the three main ones that I've read about before. Let me go and talk about those individually. When the Steyr AUG Generation 1 came out, it came with the sight fixed. It was, I think, a 2 or 3 times magnification optic. It's kind of similar to what the G36 did from Heckler & Koch. The G36 on some models had a built-in optic. I think that one was 2 times as well. But anyways, the Steyr AUG kind of had something similar going on. And as far as I've read, it was impossible to have that removed because it was built in. So a lot of armies, including the United States and many others, I'm not going to put this just on the U.S. Army, but, a lot of people were used to having their own type of optic on the weapon. And because they couldn't put their own optic on the weapon, they just didn't really like the weapon. That's kind of the gist of where that is going. As far as retraining is concerned, this is something that most people wouldn't think of if you're from one of those countries where you don't get experienced firearms or you just never touched a firearm in your life. Whatever the case may be, one of the things that people tend to not realize is when you do switch weapons, it requires completely different training because a lot of that stuff you need to have as muscle memory when you go into combat. Stuff including like where the magazine release button is or the procedures for reloading the weapon and things like that. These are all things that need to be muscle memory by the time you go into combat. So you'd have to retrain with the weapon if it has, even the slightest of a thing or a feature not in a place that you're used to. in the case of the Starog, at least if it was in the hands of the U.S. military, it would have required them to be aware that the magazine actually goes in the far back instead of the kind of center of the rifle. And the magazine released at the time, from what I've read, was not anywhere near the trigger. It was near your digits, but not near the trigger, which is may seem trivial to you, but I assure you, even just a couple inches off of like where something is supposed to be can throw you off completely. So there was also that going on in terms of like the retraining. As far as logistics are concerned, generally speaking, it does take time for a brand new weapon to have the logistics in place, such as the spare parts and stuff. You know, making all that stuff and having it ready to ship, or for that matter, sent out in a hurry if something goes wrong. These are all things that are very hard to do when a rifle is brand new. Of course, as time goes on and the rifle in question becomes more popular, those are quickly changed because people are ordering it so much that they invest the resources to have factory lines devoted to it. They do get corrected in time, but generally speaking, being an early adopter is kind of rough if you're a larger military. If you're a smaller military, then you might be able to get away with it because at that point, you don't have as many parts to worry about or as many people to arm and things of that nature. But when you're talking bigger militaries like the United States military or even the United Kingdom, those are countries where early adoption of a rifle is kind of hard to do. It can be done, but just not as easy if it were a smaller military like Poland, for example. That's actually a really interesting discussion, but not right now. But, okay, moving on. So I think I've done my best to kind of like point out all the different things with the Starog. So let me move on to the next major example that I think should be brought up, because I have a feeling this will be in games. 1 second. Let's do this. Okay, so the following discussion is about the NGSW program, which is a U.S. military program involving new weapons using a custom-made 6.8 by 51 round, which is going to be different than SPC, which is, I think, by 44, if my memory's correct. We'll get into the whole NGSW program in just a moment. I want to point this out leading up to the NGSW discussion that I had with these people. To do that, I need to point out the FN FAL. And you may be wondering what this old rifle has to do with something in 2021. Well, there's a good reason for this, because way, way back in the day, the British were experimenting with a round on the FAL, because the FAL was the standard rifle of that time period, and that round that they were experimenting with was known as the 280 British. Let me go ahead and convert that into measurements that you probably will recognize. 280 is about 7 millimeter, more or less. It's probably something a little bit more here. We can tab over and double check. Yeah, so it's 7 by 43 millimeter. Yeah, so that was close enough. But yeah, so this is a pretty big deal because when the FN FAL came out, it was well after World War II. During World War II, there was a very popular round, or at least a very good round, I should say, from the Swedish, the 6.5 millimeter. Between the 280 and the 6.5 millimeter, they showed, I guess, more or less what is a good round for the intermediate cartridge category, I guess would be the way to put it. Now, the British did try to introduce the 280 to the United States military, but this was during the time when the U.S. military had their pet projects going on, which I forget if it was the 5.56 NATO or 7.62 NATO. It was one of the two, but either way, when they were having those pet projects going on, they were so focused on finishing whichever one of the two it was that they completely dismissed the 280. This was probably back in what, like the 70s, I think. So this was a long time ago, but yeah, it's. I don't want to get into politics, but the most I'll say is that this is pretty standard American behavior, being stubborn and thinking that they know better than the rest of the world and all that. But yeah, so they dismissed the 280 because of their pet projects going on, and also because that's just kind of the way the American politics goes, usually. Not all the time, but usually. So now to bring this back into the NGSW program. So now that I've kind of explained that whole situation, let me talk about the NGSW program a little bit so you understand where I'm going with this. Okay. So here's actually a really good picture of what's going on with the NGSW program. Basically, a bunch of rifles were thrown out there into this competition, if you will, for the next rifle to replace the M4. You've seen the M4 in many games, including Counter-Strike and Call of Duty and many others, but this will eventually replace the M4. I don't agree with it, and we'll get to that in a little bit, but for right now, this is what was in the bids. Now, this was well before the winner was declared, if you wish to call it that, and 6 Hour won the contract. So that's going to be the one on the far left. So this uses a 6.8 by 51 millimeter custom cartridge. So notice the measurement and why I was discussing the foul a minute ago. Because funny enough, the British were figuring this out all these years ago, that we would eventually come to an intermediate cartridge of relatively medium caliber. And sure enough, it's come full circle. Instead of 7mm, it's 6.8. Notice that there's not much of a difference in the measurements. Not really, anyways. So it's kind of funny that we've came back to this all these years later. Yeah. So, but anyways, let's go and talk about the NGSW program and all the stuff going on here. So what's interesting is, if you'll notice, the General Dynamics bids were all Bullpups. And notice that the Textron and 6 Hours were all AR-15-like. So once again, the Bullpup has lost the contract with the U.S. military, which is really odd to me because unlike the old versions of the AUG, the General Dynamics rifles, from what I've read and seen on videos, appears to have recognized that an issue with the Bullpup is where those buttons are and other little things going on. And so they made the Bullpups as close to an AR-15 as they could in terms of making it feel like it's not a Bullpup and just making the overall operation of it easier. But unfortunately, it did not win the bid, despite their best efforts. It's really interesting to see that, but also disappointing because I do think that Bullpups have a future in the military, and I think that they do bring up an interesting discussion as well as being a good example for educational purposes. It really is interesting to talk about the differences between a Bullpup, AR-15, or AK platform. But unfortunately, that's about as far as things are going to go because Bullpups I don't think are going to receive widespread adoption like the AR-15 and AKs did. But either way, it's worth keeping tabs on this and a couple of other things. I see I failed to pull it up. Let me actually go and do that real quickly. That shouldn't take me too long to fix. Let's see. I need Wikipedia. Let's see. MSBS. There we are. Okay, so the last thing I want to kind of bring up, and this was also something that was discussed in this little conversation, I think this is also worth a look too. You won't see this in very many games, and this is probably a very good example of what I mean by games could be educational. Including rifles like this into your game is a good start. So why this is important? Well, what you're looking at is a Polish rifle. And you may think, oh, okay, it's a European country, not really a big one, whatever, probably. And you would be mostly correct. Poland isn't as big as some of the other countries in Europe, and for that matter, they don't have the military numbers as others. But the one thing they do make up for is, I guess you can say, their tenacity. This rifle is just only a portion of the discussion of when it comes to Poland. But the reason I want to bring it up is because it's an interesting rifle that hasn't really received a lot of attention. You see, here's what makes it interesting. The manufacturer in question has a long history of making firearms for other companies. Some of those companies include Walther. I've also read that they got involved with the PPSH. You've seen that submachine gun in a couple of games, and some other things. So what's interesting is, as far as I can tell, and of course there hasn't been a statement from the manufacturer, but as far as I can tell, they appear to be keeping a similar mentality to what the AK has been doing, which is making a low-cost rifle that's durable and reliable. Now, whether or not they achieved this goal is another matter, because I haven't actually seen military units tested. I've seen that Gigan tested it, and GSG9 did, which are very specialized police forces within those countries. They're anti-terrorism. So while it's interesting to see that they've tested it, unfortunately, that's not a military unit. It's not like, special forces or anything that's tested. So that's one thing that we do have to see first. But other than that, it would appear that is what's going on, is that they're trying to do that. So it would be interesting to see if they kept that. Now, another piece of this is that when it comes to firearms built for the military from a country, the one thing that you rarely see is homegrown weapon or home-built weapons, if you will. If you think about it, a lot of countries are reliant on purchasing their firearms from another country. Really, about the only countries that have military units or specialized units that make their own weapons are going to be countries like Germany, Israel, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and a couple others. Russia, too. But, other than that, really, they buy their firearms. So this marks yet another inclusion to that list of a home-built weapon made specific for their military, which is something you rarely see. The next piece of interesting tidbits regarding this rifle is who's using it. There's a special forces unit within Poland called GROM, G-R-O-M. I don't have it pulled up, but I'll put it in the description. So what makes GROM so interesting is how much they've accomplished in a short amount of time. If you look at the timeline of when all the special forces were created across the world, I'm not talking just GROM, but I'm also talking all the other units like Red Berets and things like that, right? They're much older units. SAS would be a classic example of an older special forces unit. GROM is relatively new in comparison to SAS or the other ones that you could list. And that's what makes it interesting, is despite them being so new in comparison, they've accomplished so much in a very little amount of time. Because like all these other units, they've had a long time to do it, and many wars to, make a name for themselves and, handle their training and stuff of that nature. GROM hasn't had that luxury in comparison. GROM has only had a short amount of time to get things going and, do things they want to. So that's kind of what you need to think about when you're looking at not just the rifle, but also the users involved, is more or less where I'm coming to with this entire recording. It's really interesting to read, and I highly recommend that you take the time to look at this stuff because, as I said in past recordings, a game doesn't have to be 100% realistic, but you can use real life as a compass to help you figure out how to make your game. Because if you pick up on these small little details or things like that, you can make something out of that. For example, the whole bullpup idea, well, you can make an operator that specializes in bullpups, and that would make it unique to the game, right? Or something along those lines, because some games do have that, where you have like operators with special traits or special equipment, right? So that's kind of where I'm going with this, is you can use all this stuff in real life, all this information, and you can make something out of it in your game. All it takes is a little imagination and a little bit of knowledge of what's going on in the world. But that's all I have. Thanks for listening.